Imagine confidently recalling vivid details about, I don't know, an event, maybe a conversation you had, or even a past achievement, only to discover it never actually happened. Or maybe you see a familiar face and you're just absolutely convinced you've met them before, even when you haven't. What if this isn't, intentional deception, but a fundamental glitch in how our brains construct reality? Welcome to the deep dive, where we take your sources and unpack the most fascinating insights, giving you that well-informed shortcut. Today, we're diving deep into a truly perplexing phenomenon, confabulation.
Yeah, and we've got quite a stack of intriguing sources today. Everything from rigorous clinical studies and precise neuropsychological assessments right through to philosophical analyses and even a really deeply personal narrative. Our mission really is to dissect what confabulation truly is, how it manifests, sometimes in really surprising ways, what the latest research tells us about its origins and the underlying brain mechanisms, and also why understanding it offers such profound insights, not just into how the brain can go awry, but into how all of us perceive and narrate our own lives every single day.
Exactly. We'll start by defining this concept because it's often misunderstood, isn't it? Then explore its various forms, dig into some groundbreaking research cases that really bring it to life, and we'll even consider the surprising ways it might influence everyday thinking, far beyond the clinic. Okay, so let's unpack this. So to really get into this, we first need to lay the groundwork. What is confabulation? Because, like you said, it's so much more nuanced than just someone telling a lie. At its core, confabulation is when someone produces memories, right? Fabricated ones, maybe distorted or misinterpreted memories about themselves or, the world around them. But here's the absolute key thing. They do it without any conscious intention to deceive. It's not a lie in the traditional sense,
Yeah.
not a deliberate attempt to mislead you at all.
That unintentionality. Yeah, you've hit on the most crucial element. It's the defining characteristic that truly separates confabulation from simple lying.
Hmm.
And our sources really highlight this distinction. Some contrast definitions that might mistakenly portray it as an extreme form of lying or maybe a falsification of memory, but they present the more accurate idea of it being, well, honest lying. That's a term Taylor Barber used back in '93, and Futopoulou and others echoed it later. The patients truly, genuinely believe their fabricated accounts are real memories. They aren't trying to trick anyone. Their brain is just constructing a reality that, to them, feels absolutely factual, even if it's objectively incorrect.
That distinction alone is huge, really sets it apart. But when we talk about fabricated memories, does that mean it's all one type of experience, or are there different forms confabulation can take?
That's an excellent question because, yeah, it gets even more nuanced. Researchers make a key distinction, and this is explored in studies like those by Metcalf, Langdon, and Coulthart in 2007 and Della Barba back in '93. They talk about spontaneous versus provoked confabulation. So spontaneous confabulations are the ones that arise just, well, unprompted, out of the blue, often described as a persistent, unprovoked outpouring of erroneous memories. These are the ones that just pop up in casual conversation, without any specific trigger from the outside. Think of a patient like SD, who we'll probably talk about later. He spontaneously declared, completely unprompted, that his father had been abducted by aliens over the weekend. Nobody asked him about aliens. He just offered this as a fact about his recent past.
Wow. Which is pretty wild to imagine, right? Just hearing that in a conversation. Okay, so that's when it just happens. But what about provoked confabulation? What brings those on?
Right, so provoked confabulations, on the other hand, are specifically elicited by direct questioning, particularly when a patient doesn't have the accurate information readily available. Patient MB, for instance, his confabulations were more evident when provoked by direct questioning. You ask a specific question, maybe there's a gap in their memory, and their brain just sort of fills it in, often with something plausible, but incorrect. Now, it's worth noting, many researchers, including Metcalf, Langdon, and Coulthart, they suggest that these aren't always neatly separate categories. It's more like a continuum. It's not a rigid either. It can range from minor, really subtle distortions all the way to the truly fantastical stuff, depending on the person and the context. And some patients, well, they don't neatly fit either type. They might show provoked responses in formal tests, but then have spontaneous ones pop up in daily life, yet they don't necessarily act on them. It's a complex landscape, really, how these false memories emerge.
Okay, so beyond how they're triggered, our sources also mention the nature of the false memory itself. Is it a distortion or a complete fabrication? This came up in that 1996 study by Gudjonsen and Sigurdsson, right? The one with prison inmates.
Yes, exactly. That study gave us some really valuable insights by actually categorizing the content of the confabulations. When they looked at it in that context, they defined distortions as basically existing memories that get altered or twisted somehow. So, for example, a person might misremember a specific detail from a story they heard. Maybe they recall the policeman's name as Alvardo instead of the correct Delgado. Or they might state the woman was attacked by 2 men when the story clearly said it was 3. The basic event is there, but the details are off. It's kind of like a photo that's slightly blurry or has the wrong color filter. Fabrications, though, are totally different. They're purely invented content, stuff that was never part of the original event or information at all. So an inmate might claim the woman found the policeman attractive, or maybe she had to attend hospital, when neither of those things was ever mentioned in the story they were asked to recall. These are completely made-up elements, just woven into the narrative. And what's particularly fascinating about this study, and it raises a big question about the underlying mechanisms, is that these two types, distortions and fabrications, they actually correlated poorly with each other, which suggests they might arise from different underlying psychological phenomena. It implies the brain's filling-in process isn't just one single thing. Different pathways might be responsible for twisting existing memories versus creating entirely new ones.
So the journey to understanding this really started with careful early clinical observations. One foundational study that seems to stand out is a study of confabulation by Mercer, Wapner, Gardner, and Benson from way back in 1977. What did they actually find, and how did they go about it?
Yeah, that study was truly instrumental, really shaped our foundational understanding. What they did was identify 11 patients they thought might be confabulators from a neurobehavioral center, and they categorized them into 3 groups. Severe confabulators, these were people who confabulated on more than a third of the questions asked. Mild confabulators, they confabulated on at least 2 questions, and then non-confabulators. And just for comparison, they also included 3 non-neurological patients as controls, a healthy baseline. Their method involved structured interviews, carefully designed to probe memory across different time frames and contexts, everything from recent personal stuff to more remote, well-established facts. And a key finding from Mercer and his colleagues was that confabulation was strongly related to a patient's inability to, withhold answers, and also to monitor their own responses and provide verbal self-corrections. So essentially, it wasn't just a memory problem in isolation. It pointed to a deeper issue with the brain's sort of internal editor, that self-monitoring system that lets us check our thoughts before we speak or catch ourselves making a mistake. And crucially, their study did not confirm those previously hypothesized links between confabulation and suggestibility, or the overall degree of memory disorder or disorientation. This really challenged earlier assumptions that maybe people just confabulate because they're easily led, or maybe they just have broad general cognitive issues. It pointed to something more specific, maybe an executive function breakdown.
That's a really significant finding right there, that it's not just about being suggestible. Can you elaborate a bit? How did confabulators perform on different types of memory questions in that study? Did they struggle across the board, or were there specific areas where it was much worse?
That's where it gets really interesting. Their performance was strikingly uneven, revealing these specific vulnerabilities. So when asked about remote memories, things from their distant past, childhood, major life events, both severe and mild confabulators actually did relatively well. Severe confabulators only confabulated on about 14% of these questions, and mild ones even less. It seems like those older, deeply ingrained memories were more intact, almost like an archive that, maybe it wasn't perfectly indexed, but it still held up better. But then you look at recent memories, and this is where the picture just dramatically changed. These were questions about things that happened maybe hours or days ago. Severe confabulators, they gave correct responses to only a dismal 12% of these questions, and they confabulated on a staggering 2/3 of them. Mild confabulators did a bit better, getting about 60% correct, but still, 18% of their responses were confabulations. And get this, a remarkable 95% of all their confabulations occurred in this recent memory category.
Wow, 95%.
Yeah. So it's not just a general memory fault. It's a very specific vulnerability in how these patients handle new information. It suggests that the brain's ability to correctly timestamp and integrate fresh experiences, that might be a foundational pillar of our perceived reality. And when it crumbles, so do the narrative of the now.
Okay, so it's really specific to recent memories. Did the researchers try giving cues to help them remember? And what happened then? Did that help at all?
This is another incredibly insightful part of that study. When they provided cues, the mild confabulators actually used them quite effectively. Their performance improved greatly. Their correct responses jumped from just 36% without cues to an impressive 95% with them, so that they could benefit from those gentle nudges. But in sharp contrast, the severe confabulators struggled significantly. They only even attempted to use cues on less than a third of the chances they got. And even when they did, correct responses emerged less than half the time. And here's the surprising twist. The study noted that severe confabulators actually perform better when cues were unavailable.
Better without cues. That seems counterintuitive.
Right. It suggests that maybe the cues themselves interfered with their already fractured internal processes. Or perhaps it just highlighted the gaps too starkly, making their sort of compensatory confabulation mechanism work less effectively. And then there were the I don't know questions. When they were faced with a question they just couldn't answer, severe confabulators produced frank confabulations on 17% of those trials. They preferred to invent rather than just admit ignorance. Mild confabulators, though, were much more likely to just respond, I don't know. They did that on 75% of those questions and only confabulated on 5%. This stark difference in their willingness to admit uncertainty, it further supports the idea of different underlying mechanisms between mild and severe confabulation, with the severe cases showing this profound lack of self-awareness about their own memory deficits.
That difference between mild and severe really paints a clearer picture. But this all begs the question, doesn't it? Where exactly in the brain are these processes going wrong? What are the neurological underpinnings here?
That's the crucial next step, absolutely. Classical clinical reports have pretty consistently linked confabulation to frontal pathologies, meaning damage or disease in the frontal lobes, that front part of your brain that's so critical for personality, decision-making, planning, self-control, all that stuff. This damage often comes from trauma or vascular brain disease like strokes, sometimes tumors. But more recent, more precise research, like from Shanks and colleagues in 2014, and Metcalf, Langdon, and Coulthart in 2007, has pinpointed even more specific areas, particularly the orbitofrontal and inframedial frontal cortices. These are specialized parts of your medial prefrontal cortex, the region right behind your forehead. This area is consistently implicated in spontaneous confabulation. And interestingly, there's no evidence of lateralization, meaning it's not just restricted to one side of the brain. Gobo and Moscovich, in a 2002 review cited by Metcalf, found this pattern held up across many cases. What's also really crucial here is the relationship between confabulation and amnesia memory loss. Now, amnesia is typically associated with bilateral damage on both sides, to limbic structures like the hippocampus, the mammillary bodies, the thalamus. These are often thought of as the brain's main memory centers, vital for forming and retrieving new memories. But studies have shown that lesions or damage specifically to the medial prefrontal cortex can be sufficient on its own to produce confabulation. In fact, nearly half of the cases reviewed by Gobo and Moscovich showed no damage to those typical memory regions.
Really? Half?
Yeah, it's a profound insight. It suggests that confabulation isn't just a byproduct of general memory loss. It can arise from a very specific disruption in frontal lobe function that impacts how memories are retrieved, organized, and maybe most importantly, validated as real.
So it's about a specific brain region and its function, not just a general memory problem hitting everywhere. And we also see confabulation popping up in broader conditions like Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative states, right?
That's absolutely right. While the clearest links are often to direct frontal lobe damage, confabulation is also a known symptom in a range of neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, as Shanks et al. Noted. It can even be seen in some conditions described as functional psychoses, like schizophrenia. That's something Langdon and Bain explored in 2010, and Metcalf and colleagues mentioned it too. This suggests that while there might be common neural pathways involved across these conditions, the fact that confabulation appears in such diverse neurological and psychiatric states, well, it highlights its complex interplay with various cognitive and neurological processes that go beyond just a simple lesion. It's definitely a multifaceted phenomenon.
To really get a handle on the impact of confabulation and see how it actually plays out in real people's lives, let's look at some of these compelling case studies from our sources. Patient 11 from that Mercer et al. 1977 study offers a really fascinating glimpse, not just into the condition itself, but also the potential for recovery. Can you walk us through his story?
Patient 11's case is incredibly instructive, yeah, because it beautifully demonstrates the dynamic nature of confabulation, especially how it can improve with medical intervention. He initially came into the hospital after a really severe head trauma. This led to serious conditions like a subarachnoid hemorrhage that's bleeding around the brain in the space between the brain and the membrane surrounding it, and also intracerebral hematomas, which were basically blood clots forming inside the brain tissue itself. At first, he showed what the researchers called mild confabulation. But then his condition noticeably deteriorated. His memory got worse, and both disorientation and confabulation increased significantly, eventually qualifying him as a severe confabulator. This decline was later thought to be due to normal pressure hydrocephalus, a condition where cerebrospinal fluid builds up in the brain's cavities, putting pressure on the brain, even if the overall skull pressure isn't necessarily high.
And here's where his story takes that remarkable turn, right? His condition then showed a dramatic improvement after a specific medical procedure.
Precisely. A ventricular-pleural shunt was implanted. That's basically a tube surgically placed to drain the excess cerebrospinal fluid from the brain's ventricles into another part of the body, like the chest cavity where it can be absorbed. And following this procedure, he experienced, as the paper puts it, a dramatic improvement in his mental status. He became well-oriented, his significant cognitive and memory deficits largely resolved, and the confabulation gradually cleared up over time. This whole process offered striking quantitative and qualitative features for observation. It allowed researchers to track his recovery in really fine detail. As his condition improved post-shunt, the number of confabulations decreased markedly, while his correct responses showed the opposite pattern, increasing steadily. What was especially significant, though, and offered this crucial window into the underlying recovery process, was the change in his verbal self-corrections. During his recovery, the number of times he overtly corrected himself, literally saying things like, "No, that's not right, let me try again," increased markedly before it leveled off. And this paralleled how effective those checks were. In his deteriorating phase, less than a fifth of his corrections actually led to a correct response. But during recovery, more than half of his self-corrections ultimately resulted in the right answer. Furthermore, the latency of his responses, the pauses before answering a question, was very low during his most severe illness, suggesting maybe a prepotent response, answers just sort of erupting without hesitation or checking. But this latency rose dramatically during recovery, especially after those overt self-corrections had peaked. It suggests an internal self-correction process was now kicking in. He was effectively thinking aloud, checking, reviewing his own thoughts before committing to an answer or function that was previously impaired.
That's incredibly insightful, seeing a patient actually regain that internal self-monitoring function. Can you give us some concrete examples of this recovery in action? Like, how did he answer simple questions before and after the shunt?
Absolutely. The examples are quite vivid. So when asked to identify the president during his decline, he'd confidently say Johnson or Eisenhower, even Hart from the South Washington area. Clearly confabulations. But after the shunt was implanted, his responses started showing this internal processing, that emerging self-correction. First, he proposed, "Not Johnson, I don't know." Then in the next interview, he said, "Not Johnson, but I was thinking about a football player without a helmet." Still incorrect, but showing an attempt to recall and verify. And finally, in later interviews, he correctly named Ford. You see a similar pattern when he was asked to name the hospital he was in. His usual response during decline was the West Roxbury VA hospital. After surgery, he first replied, "A VA hospital, but not in West Roxbury." Then, after hesitation, a pause that seemed like an internal struggle, he correctly responded that he was in the Jamaica Plains VA. This detailed progression just underscores the reemergence of that crucial self-monitoring function. It illustrates the brain's remarkable capacity for recovery when the underlying issue can be addressed.
That detailed account of recovery is truly remarkable. Now, moving from recovery to something much more persistent and, frankly, bizarre, let's turn to patient SD, described by Metcalf, Langdon, and Coulthart in their 2007 study. This was a 36-year-old male whose confabulations were described as frequent and unprovoked after a severe bicycle accident. What did his confabulations actually sound like?
Patient SD's case really illustrates the, outlandish and often persistent nature confabulations can take. When asked about his current location while he was actually in a rehabilitation unit, he would consistently claim it was XXXX high school and that he was there for PE, English, and maths. He even believed his own children attended the rehabilitation center where he was, stating they would sing songs and write words. These are prime examples of what are sometimes called misplaced true memories. Elements from his past, like attending school or his kids being at some center, are incorrectly applied to his current, very different reality. His brain was taking real fragments of his life and just sticking them in the wrong context, creating this distorted present. But it gets even more bizarre, and this offers a window into how the brain can kind of weave narratives. SD once claimed his father had been abducted by aliens over the previous weekend.
Abducted by aliens? Seriously?
Yeah. And while this sounds completely fantastical, our sources tell us the researchers were actually able to trace this back to what they called a false conjunction of events. See, his father hadn't visited as usual that weekend, creating a gap in his recent memory. And importantly, his grandchildren had recently been playing with toy aliens in his presence. His brain in its attempt to make sense of the missing visit and fill that gap, seems to have inadvertently connected two unrelated yet recent pieces of information: his father's absence and the toy aliens, to create this wildly imaginative, yet to him, completely real scenario.
What's particularly striking about SD, though, isn't just what he said, but that he didn't just say these things, he acted on them. How did his confabulations actually influence his behavior?
You're absolutely right. This is such a critical distinction. It truly highlights the profound level of conviction these patients have in their fabricated realities. It's not just a passing thought. It's a deeply held, actionable belief. Think about the impact. SD would wake up convinced he needed to attend a swimming carnival at school that day, and he would actively try to find his swimming costume, despite being 76 years old and physically disabled from his accident. His confabulations weren't merely verbal expressions, they profoundly drove his behavior. It demonstrates a complete integration of these fabricated realities into his perceived present. He was, in a very real sense, living and breathing these untrue narratives.
Okay, next up, we turn to patient HF, detailed by Shanks and colleagues in their 2014 study. This was a 74-year-old retired businessman who had something called amnestic mild cognitive impairment. Can you tell us what that means first, and then describe his symptoms? Because they included bizarre confabulations and déjà vécu.
Certainly. So, amnestic mild cognitive impairment, or AMCI, is a condition where there's a noticeable decline in memory ability, more than you'd expect for someone of that age. But it's not severe enough yet to interfere with daily life to the extent that full dementia would. So HF had significant memory issues, but was still largely functional. His case is particularly compelling because of those two striking symptoms you mentioned: bizarre confabulations and déjà vécu. Now, déjà vécu literally translates to already lived, and it describes an episodically mediated erroneous sensation of recollection. What that means is novel events, people, or places are vividly experienced as having happened before, even when they absolutely haven't. For HF, this was pervasive. His wife first noticed it when they visited Mauritius for the very first time. He had great difficulty learning the new surroundings, but kept insisting he had been there before. He genuinely believed everything he encountered was a repeat experience. He even claimed he could predict the course of the immediate future, which is quite a chilling symptom when you think about it. And his fantastic confabulations were equally striking. They were spontaneous, bizarre in content, often quite grandiose in scale. His narratives included themes of black magical abilities, like teleportation and spellcasting. He even spoke of telepathy, which he called flashing, claiming he could mentally connect between his son-in-law and an imaginary grandson he thought they had. He fabricated stories that were entirely false, like claiming his daughter was married to a rich Indian businessman with a vineyard in France. Not true at all. And in one truly outlandish account, he claimed his plane was hijacked en route to Moscow, where he met President Putin. These weren't subtle distortions. They were full-blown, elaborate, utterly impossible narratives that he absolutely believed were real.
Wow, so when you combine these fantastic confabulations with that pervasive déjà vécu, what does this tell us? It suggests a much deeper disorder of awareness, doesn't it? It's something beyond just filling memory gaps.
It absolutely does, and this is why HF's case is so illuminating. It really challenges some existing theories because, get this, he showed only mild deficits in executive function tests and just borderline performance in long-term memory tests. He wasn't severely impaired across the board. This led the researchers to argue that his fantastic confabulation and déjà vécu arose not just from memory deficits, but from a more fundamental disorder of awareness.
True.
In his case, the immediate retention of experience seemed to be colored by the subjective. It blurred the distinction between his internal subjective experience, his thoughts, feelings, imaginings, and the objective real world out there. He wasn't just misremembering. He was experiencing the present as if it were some fantastical past event and uncritically accepting it as reality. His awareness of what was real versus what was imagined was fundamentally broken.
Next, let's look at patient MB, a 75-year-old man from Dalla-Barba's 1993 study. He presented as a pure amnesic, meaning his memory impairment wasn't really associated with other significant cognitive problems like language or general intelligence issues.
That's right. Embiid was deeply disoriented in time and place. He often believed he was in, say, an Italian's doctor's office in Bologna, or that the month was June across multiple interviews, despite actually being in a hospital in a different country and a different month entirely. Yet, as you mentioned, his general intelligence and his semantic knowledge, his knowledge of facts, concepts, the world in general, were completely normal. His confabulations were particularly prominent in episodic memory, his memory for specific events and orientation, and they showed high persistence and consistency across sessions. What that means is he would repeat the same fabricated details and narratives whenever asked the same questions, almost as if he was drawing from a consistent, albeit completely false, internal script. But the truly unique finding with MB came out when he was asked if he remembered or simply knew certain information. When he provided a confabulatory response, he attributed a remember judgment to it, just like he did for his correct episodic memories.
So he felt he remembered the false stuff just as strongly as the true stuff.
Exactly. This is key. Most of us can distinguish between knowing a fact, Paris is the capital of France, and truly remembering an experience. I remember visiting the Eiffel Tower. For MB, that distinction was profoundly blurred for his false memories. This indicates, as Delabarba put it, a pathological conscious awareness of his personal past. He wasn't just producing false information, he was experiencing it as a genuine personal recollection. And he had absolutely no awareness of his memory difficulties or the fabricated nature of his claims. He was living his confabulations as deeply felt real experiences.
That's incredibly poignant, isn't it? That deep immersion in an unreal reality. And that leads us actually to Malka Henny's deeply personal narrative from 2009. She describes her experience grappling with her own father's late-life dementia and confabulation. Her father, for much of her life, was perceived as, quote, the best read, most broadly knowledgeable, someone who spoke absolutely definitively with extraordinary details. This must have been such a painful realization for her.
It is, very much so. It's a truly heartbreaking account. The daughter shares her poignant realization that as his condition progressed, a significant proportion of what he tells you is not true. It never happened. She describes how he mixed truth and falsehood seamlessly, making it, in her words, virtually impossible to tell where the line falls between reality and his fabricated memories. And the unsettling part is, it's also unclear if he is aware of this blend. He maintains that confident, definitive speaking style, complete with vivid but often false details, presenting these constructed realities with the same conviction as genuine memories.
That must have had such a profound personal impact on the author, making her question her entire history with him, right? Wondering if the person she knew was always like this.
Absolutely. The author questioned if her father was always like this. It prompted her to reevaluate her childhood idolization of him. She realized that her previous perceptions had perhaps blinded her to his faults, even to frightening outbursts of rage, which she only witnessed or maybe recognized later in life as his condition progressed. And this raises a deeply speculative yet critical question within the source itself, a question many family members probably face. Is his confabulation simply a recent technique, largely unconscious, for narrating his life as he would like it to have been? Or has it always been there? This speaks to the profound and unsettling impact of confabulation on personal history, on the very fabric of family relationships, and on the foundation of what individuals consider a shared reality. It's a stark reminder that our understanding of those closest to us can be built on surprisingly fragile ground, and that the stories we tell ourselves and are told by others aren't always objective truths.
Okay, so we've heard about what confabulation is, and we've seen how it plays out in these fascinating, sometimes heartbreaking, real-world cases. Now let's try to unpack the why and how behind it. For a long time, confabulation was often seen pretty simply, right? As just filling a memory gap or maybe being overly suggestible. But our sources suggest it's way more complex than that.
That's a really critical shift in understanding, yeah. The idea that confabulation is merely a normal response to a faulty memory, or just a straightforward way to fill an amnesic gap, a blank space in memory as some early theories proposed, it just doesn't really hold up under closer scrutiny. Studies, including those by Delabarba and colleagues in '97 and Metcalf et al. In 2007, have shown that confabulation can be totally independent of the availability of the correct answer. It's not just a placeholder. It's a fabricated response that exists whether or not the real memory is simply inaccessible or completely gone. The brain isn't just finding a substitute, it's actively creating something new and believing it to be true. And that linked to suggestibility, the idea that patients are just easily led into believing false information, that's largely been debunked as well. Both the Mercer et al. Study from '77 and the Gudjonsen and Sigurdsson study from '96 explicitly found no significant correlation between confabulation and suggestibility, directly challenging those previous assumptions. Remember patient MB, who we discussed earlier, he never confabulated in response to "I don't know" questions. That's a situation where you might expect a highly suggestible person to just invent an answer to please the questioner. His brain wasn't simply being led, it was actively constructing a false reality from within.
Okay, so if it's not just about filling gaps or suggestibility, What are the key cognitive models trying to explain the why and how of confabulation? Let's start with those temporal context theories, like Dalla-Barba's temporal consciousness theory. What's the idea there?
Right, so Dalla-Barba and colleagues propose that a primary impairment in confabulation lies in establishing a personal temporal consciousness. You can think of it as your internal calendar and timeline for your own life events. While patients might retain a general awareness of past, present, and future, their ability to place specific personal events within their correct temporal context, to know when something happened relative to other things, is severely disrupted. This leads them to rely on the most stable elements of their autobiographical memories, which often results in confusing well-established routines and habits with current events, rather than forming and placing new, distinct memories correctly. And when the long-term storage system itself, the actual stored memory information, is also degraded, this can give rise to the more fantastic or bizarre confabulations. The raw material available for constructing memories becomes less coherent, more prone to these outlandish combinations. Schneider had a similar idea too, seeing confabulation as a confusion of ongoing reality with past events, really emphasizing that faulty temporal tagging of experiences. Things happening now get mistakenly perceived as things that happened before.
Okay, then there are the strategic retrieval theories, like Moscovich's hypothesis. This suggests confabulation results from deficient strategic retrieval processes. How does that model explain the mechanism?
So Moscovich proposed that these strategic retrieval processes are the sort of self-initiated, goal-directed routines we use to actively search for and evaluate memories. It's like the mental effort you put in when you're trying to recall a specific detail, and then checking if that detail really fits the context. According to this view, damage to these strategic processes leads to a faulty search. Maybe the brain pulls up incorrect or irrelevant information, or it leads to an impaired ability to monitor the retrieved information, failing to filter out the inaccurate bits. The result is that memories get produced without their appropriate temporal spatial context. They're pulled out of the archive, but maybe without the correct date or location tags. Or they get mixed up with other memories, basically pulling out information but failing to place it correctly in time or distinguish it from other similar memories. However, there's counter-evidence that suggests this isn't the whole picture. The case of patient GA from that Dalla-Barba et al. 1997 study really casts some doubt on this as the sole cause. GA's confabulations were largely confined to episodic memory, her memory for specific life events. And crucially, she showed an absence of confabulation in semantic memory tasks. Her knowledge of general facts, even those tasks that clearly demanded strategic retrieval. Plus, her normal performance on the cognitive estimates test, which requires significant strategic retrieval and estimation, directly contradicted the idea that a general strategic retrieval deficit was the root cause of her confabulation. This suggests the problem might be more domain-specific, maybe tied more closely to personal experiences, rather than a generalized issue with all memory retrieval.
Interesting. What about the reality monitoring hypothesis? That suggests confabulation reflects a disruption in distinguishing between real and imagined events. How does that theory hold up?
Johnson's theory, posits that confabulation stems from a failure to distinguish between what actually happened and what was merely imagined or dreamt or thought about. It's really about being unable to correctly identify the source of a memory trace. But this hypothesis also faces challenges when you look at specific cases. Remember patient HF, the one with déjà vu from the Shanks et al. 2014 study. He performed within normal limits on tests specifically designed to assess source memory and the ability to suppress irrelevant items. This suggests that for HF, at least, failure to suppress intrusions was not causal in this case, end quote. He could tell the difference on specific tests, yet still confabulated wildly in his daily life. Additionally, critics argue the reality monitoring hypothesis doesn't fully explain why confabulation is so often confined to autobiographical memory, as we saw in cases like GA. It seems that simply failing to distinguish real from imagined doesn't quite account for the selective nature of the confabulatory content, which often centers so strongly on one's personal past.
Okay, so this all really points to a more intricate reality, doesn't it? It seems like no single theory fully explains confabulation on its own, suggesting a more complex interplay of factors, especially given the variety of ways it manifests, from subtle distortions to those really wild fabrications we heard about. What's the more comprehensive model then?
You're absolutely right. The evidence strongly suggests it's a multifaceted problem. And this leads us to what Metcalfe, Langdon, and Coulthard proposed back in 2007, an overarching framework. It builds on a model of delusional belief formation, but adapts it specifically for confabulation. This framework suggests that at least two deficits are likely present and interacting in most cases of confabulation. The first is an executive control retrieval deficit. This is basically an impaired ability to effectively search for and select appropriate memories, particularly from that autobiographical episodic memory store, the detailed memories of your life experiences. It's kind of like the internal librarian in your brain struggles to find the right book, or worse, consistently picks the wrong one entirely, leading to inappropriate memories being brought forward into consciousness. The second deficit is a belief evaluation impairment. This refers to an uncritical acceptance of implausible hypotheses. In simpler terms, it means the person is unable to properly evaluate whether a memory or idea they've retrieved is actually plausible or true in the current context. This could manifest as a jumping to conclusions bias, where patients quickly accept an idea as true without enough evidence or critical thought. Or it could be an inability to properly evaluate conflicting information, or even a failure of a kind of internal discrepancy detector, that alarm system that normally alerts us when our own thoughts seem implausible or contradictory. This impairment is what allows the confabulator to maintain such a strong, unwavering belief in their false accounts, even when faced with clear, contradictory evidence from the outside world. But the framework adds a third crucial factor, and this really highlights the human element: personal biases. These are emotional or motivational influences that can actually steer the preferential selection of memories. Consider patient ES, described by Fotopoulou and colleagues in 2004. His confabulations weren't just abundant, they were consistently rated by observers as being more pleasant than the actual corresponding situations in his life.
More pleasant,
Yeah,
like wishful thinking.
exactly. For example, he claimed to own a Porsche when he didn't, or claimed to have had a wonderful family vacation when the reality was apparently far less idyllic. This strongly suggests that wishful thoughts might be preferentially generated when actual, less pleasant, or simply inaccessible memories are called upon. It's not just a purely cognitive breakdown. It's a cognitive breakdown that seems to have an emotional or motivational bent, subtly constructing a more desirable reality for the individual. It really highlights that profound connection between our memories and our sense of self.
And this is where our deep dive gets really personal, doesn't it? Because we're not just talking about clinical cases and brain regions anymore. Our sources touch on how confabulation, or maybe something very much like it, plays a role in everyday life, particularly in how we rationalize our own behavior and motivations.
That's a crucial and absolutely fascinating point. And Ellie Jefferson's 2018 work on moral rationalizations and confabulations really illuminates this. She discusses how individuals, just in everyday life, can provide sincerely believed explanations of behavior which are ill-grounded and normally inaccurate, often citing moral reasons that maybe weren't the true motivators at the time. It's not about conscious deception. It's about our brains constructing narratives that make sense to us, that make us feel good about ourselves, even if they aren't strictly factual accounts of why we did something. We unconsciously edit our own past, you could say. And what's truly fascinating here is that there can be surprising potential benefits to this kind of everyday, low-level confabulation or rationalization. One is self-consistency. If we tell ourselves we acted for a good moral reason, say, I helped that person because I'm a generous person, even if that wasn't the actual primary motive in the moment, we're more likely to act consistently with that self-attributed reason in the future. It can create a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, shaping our future behavior in a positive direction.
Another potential benefit is self-enhancement. It might not actually be problematic that these explanations are subtly false, or maybe driven by a desire to look good. In fact, having a positive self-image can be a powerful motivator for positive behavior. Studies cited by Jefferson show this effect quite clearly with children. Simply labeling them as tidy or generous made them significantly more likely to behave that way later on, even if the initial labeling wasn't necessarily based on totally consistent behavior up to that point.
Okay, this next finding really shifts our perspective, doesn't it? The idea that this isn't always bad.
It absolutely does, because this unconscious narrative building can actually open up space for the adoption of certain motives for action in a way that a more realistic self-assessment would not. Think about it. If we were brutally honest with ourselves all the time, constantly acknowledging every flaw and shortcoming, we might struggle to grow or change. But by unconsciously framing our past actions in a more positive, maybe more moral light, even if it's not strictly true at the time, it allows us to shape ourselves in a better way going forward. So the falsity at the time of the initial self-ascription isn't necessarily the problem. It's what that self-ascribed motive allows us to become in the future. It's almost like a benign form of self-deception that can serve a positive psychological function. However, There are also significant potential costs. This is where it can get tricky. When these rationalizations reinforce bad moral arguments and justifications, they can unfortunately lead to a skewed moral judgment over time. Instead of adjusting our behavior to align with our established moral standards, we end up subtly adjusting our moral standards to justify our past or present behavior. This can lead to adopting problematic principles like, to use an example from the source, the idea that we do not need to help the poor as they have brought their plight on themselves. That kind of rationalization doesn't just excuse potentially immoral behavior. It can make future immoral actions more likely because of those same self-consistency pressures. And the strongest effects, positive or negative, tend to occur when confabulation and rationalization coincide, especially when there's what Jefferson calls a justificatory gap, a difference between our behavior and our stated beliefs, and the person is aiming for both self-justification and self-explanation. It's in this overlap that these self-narratives wield their greatest, often unconscious influence on our character.
And the lines can blur even more when we consider that complex relationship between confabulation and delusions, which Langdon and Bain explored in their 2010 work. How do those concepts overlap, and where do they diverge?
Langdon and Bain adopt what they call an inclusive approach. They argue that some symptoms can indeed qualify as both delusional and confabulatory. It's not always an either situation. They contend that spontaneous memory-based confabulations, in particular, share the cardinal signs of delusions. First, there's incomprehensibility. The belief is unwarranted, makes no sense to others. Second, incorrigibility. It persists despite overwhelming counter-evidence and logical arguments. And third, subjective conviction. The patient is absolutely certain it's true, often without a shred of doubt. These hallmarks are present in both phenomena. To refine this further, they introduce the concept of a received reflective spectrum of delusions. Spontaneous confabulation, they argue, falls squarely on the received end of the spectrum. What this means is the confabulated content, the false memory, is uncritically endorsed as a genuine memory. It's experienced much like a direct perception. The patient isn't reasoning their way to the false belief, they are simply experiencing it as a memory, and it's automatically accepted as true, regardless of how implausible it might seem to an outside observer. It's received as a given, not arrived at as a conclusion. They illustrate this really well with a compelling example comparing two hypothetical patients, Jane versus Jake. Jane is described as a delusional, spontaneous confabulator who has a clear underlying memory pathology. She recalls seeing her neighbor involved in her car crash, an event that never actually happened. For Jane, this is a received delusion. It just arrives in her consciousness as a valid memory, almost like a direct sensory input. Jake, on the other hand, has a delusional memory, but no underlying memory pathology. He imagines his neighbor's involvement in some hypothetical crash, and over time, this thought was no longer merely entertained, but believed with a delusional certainty. This is a more reflective delusion, one that developed perhaps through thought, rumination, maybe obsessive conviction, rather than arriving as a direct, uncritical recollection.
What's truly fascinating here is how that distinction between Jane and Jake really underscores that the underlying pathology, the root cause in the brain, is more important for classifying these things than just the content of the false belief itself. Jane and Jake might believe the exact same fabricated thing, but the way they arrived at that belief and the specific brain mechanisms involved are fundamentally different. It really makes you think about the nature of belief, memory, and maybe even identity itself.
Exactly. This highlights the profound complexity of trying to categorize these experiences and how vital it is to look beyond just the surface level of the false belief. It reminds us that our subjective experience of reality and the narratives we construct about it can be far more intricate and, well, prone to unforeseen distortions than we might commonly assume. So when we step back and look at everything we've discussed, what does this all really mean? Confabulation is clearly far more than just a simple mistake or a conscious lie. It's really a profound window into that intricate dance between our memory systems, our self-awareness, and our fundamental, often unconscious, drive to construct and maintain a coherent narrative of our world and our place within it. It reveals the brain's constant, often unconscious, attempts to maintain a sense of order, even if that order isn't strictly factual.
And its clinical importance is undeniable, right? Understanding confabulation is crucial for diagnosing and managing patients with brain injuries, strokes, various neurodegenerative conditions. Those subtle shifts we saw in recovery, like in patient 11 with his increased self-correction and pauses, they provide crucial indicators for prognosis. And they highlight the profound impact of impaired awareness on a patient's ability to actually navigate the reality. It's not just about what they remember, but how they are aware of their own remembering and its accuracy.
Absolutely. But beyond the clinic, that connection to everyday rationalization, the kind Inelli Jefferson explored, serves as a powerful reminder that our own narratives of self are probably not always perfectly factual either. The brain, in its constant effort to maintain coherence and maybe a positive self-image, can subtly and unconsciously weave in details that weren't strictly true, but served some purpose at the time. Sometimes for better, maybe motivating us to become better versions of ourselves through that drive for self-consistency, and sometimes, unfortunately for worse, by allowing us to justify less moral actions and perhaps adjust our own standards downwards over time.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful reminder of the subjective filtering that shapes all our personal histories and maybe even our moral compasses.
The deep dive never truly ends, does it? And neither does the research here. So, looking ahead, what's next for understanding confabulation? What are the promising avenues for future research?
Well, future research will undoubtedly continue to map the complex brain networks involved in self-awareness, reality monitoring, and memory validation, pushing the boundaries of neuroscientific explanation even further. Refining those multi-factor models, like the three-factor framework we discussed, will help us better understand the really variable symptoms we see across different individuals and conditions, and maybe clarify that intricate interplay of cognitive deficits, evaluative impairments, and those emotional or motivational biases that give rise to these false memories. And perhaps, with this deeper knowledge, we will eventually see more targeted therapeutic interventions. Interventions that go beyond just treating simple memory deficits and actually address the core issues of self-monitoring and belief evaluation, potentially helping patients rebuild a more accurate and stable connection to their own reality.
So, given everything we've learned today about the brain's sometimes unconscious tendency towards confabulation and rationalization, both in clinical cases and potentially in everyday life, how might our own well-informed perspectives, the stories we tell ourselves and others about our past, our motivations, even our futures, how might they be subtly shaped by similar unintentional processes? Weaving a narrative that's maybe less about strict, objective truth and more about what serves our sense of self, our coherence, or even our desires.